I've got a question from a member of the audience named Jay, asking me about the central concepts of meditation in ancient Buddhism, the ancient form of Buddhism from which all the modern variations of the religion are derived. In the analytical discussion of religion in the 21st century, we have to do two things that modern Western academia is terrible at doing. You might even say we have to do two things that universities in the 21st century are incapable of doing. I think it's very difficult for anyone to really struggle with the limitations that are set on rational inquiry in the 21st century. The limitation that prevents the professor or the students from bluntly saying or engaging in a discussion with the fact that this is bullshit. Anyone who is just going to pick up the raw doctrine of Mormonism and frankly analyze it and discuss it in the classroom has to deal with bullshit. And whether you use slightly more polite terms or not, it really needs to be that rough, that incisive, and that honest. We need to deal with the extent to which religious doctrine is untrue and bad and dangerous and wrong, and it wasn't even written by people who had good intentions. The founders of Mormonism did not have good intentions. I mean, that's one that's recent enough in historical memory that we know with great precision exactly what happened and why. But go into any university classroom and you will see the tremendous difficulty with which professors struggle to very vaguely communicate to their students that there's something wrong even with Scientology, let alone Islam, let alone Buddhism, right? And it's not enough to just communicate to your students, here's what's wrong with this religion, which is, it's going to be a lot. That's going to be most of what you deal with in the province of religion. It's then also necessary to explore, why did people enjoy making themselves slaves to this ideology? So it's easy for us here on YouTube to do step one of that rational inquiry. It's easy for us to sit down and say, okay, let's talk about all the ways in which Mormonism is just bullshit. Let's sit down here and really talk in a forthright and open way about why Scientology is just bullshit. We can do that here on YouTube. And culturally, if not politically, professors and students cannot do that in a university classroom. And it's a really fundamental problem with our universities. And the universities do indeed train people in terms of not just how to think, but more importantly, the custom of what is thinkable and what is unthinkable. And I can remember a time when some of those habits of mine were conditioned into me. When I was very young, and it was just like, oh no, you can't question the ways in which Islam is a good religion, or Muslims are good people, or you can't question the idea, the extent to which the people who created the religion in the first place had good intentions, and then all the problems with the religion must just be later corruptions or later misinterpretations that crept into it. This kind of charitable, polite apologetics in the history of religion. No. Here on YouTube, at least step one, we can be blunt about. But then there's a further challenge, because once we have faced up to, openly and honestly, that most of what we're talking about here, it's just the accumulation of pernicious lies with the veneer of respectability put over it, repackaged and sold to you as custom, tradition, faith, right? We then have to explain to ourselves and others, we have to engage in a kind of analysis to understand, why did people not only accept this, they didn't just accept this grudgingly, they became passionate, enthusiastic proponents and exponents of these beliefs. They made themselves slaves to this ideology willingly, eagerly, right? You have to look at the popularity of Islam, the popularity of Mormonism, the popularity even of Scientology, and the passion of the faithful, the people who subscribe to it, what their motives are, what it means to them, what it is they feel is good about it. And this is by no means to say that you look at the advantages and disadvantages of religion. In my opinion, what you have to understand is both of these categories are disadvantages. Both of these are tragic reflections of human nature. I mean, which is more terrible? the ways in which the doctrine itself is bullshit, or the ways in which human beings are eager to subjugate themselves, abase themselves, make themselves slaves, proponents, exponents, missionaries for these doctrines. These are two different categories of tragedy. It's not that we're talking about advantages and disadvantages on two contrasting sides of the coin. Okay? There's a footnote here I have to add about Buddhist meditation and jhana itself. If you search right now within Google, you'll find various people talking about jhana, telling you what this word jhana means, allegedly, telling you what the history or foundation of Buddhist meditational practice is, right? I'm going to put out here the hypothesis that not a single one of these videos is based on quoting and explaining to you what the actual ancient text says. So if you search YouTube for Jesus Christ Sermon on the Mount explained, I think you can find many, many, many YouTube videos of Christian preachers explaining to you what the Sermon on the Mount meant by directly quoting the text, maybe discussing with you issues in translation from Greek to English, maybe once in a while they talk about a few Hebrew words, where it's really exegesis. It's explaining the meaning of the text and then explaining what the doctrine means today, where it's very directly based on the text. By contrast, what you are seeing in Buddhism with attempts to explain jhana and meditation reflects a profound discomfort with the text. There was a professor, I don't know if he's now retired or deceased, Lance Cousins. He's a great example of someone. He went through his whole career telling students, no, there's nothing in the Pali Canon about meditation. There's no text in it. I can remember talking about this with other specialists, other experts who actually read and translated the original ancient text. It's like, somebody should do a research project to figure out who was the first person to make this excuse. Because it really is a guru's excuse. It really is saying, oh no, you have to trust me. You have to trust what I'm telling you, because there's nothing in the ancient text that's going to answer this question. Like, you have to believe in my personal authority, my personal charismatic interpretation of the religion. And that's not true at all. All the professors who've stood up in university classrooms around the world, and all the Buddhist monks who tell you that meditation is not explained or not recorded in the ancient texts of the Pali Canon, they are lying to you. And there are only two possibilities. Either they know that they're lying, or they're unaware that they're lying because they're imitating something that another professor told them, or another Buddhist monk told them, or both. They've learned this behavior. But many people will go to any lengths to avoid dealing with what the ancient scriptures actually say in Buddhism. And that's why you get bizarre claims made. Like, for example, Buddhists will tell you, including Buddhist monks and including white people who have PhDs in Buddhism and are professors, there are Buddhists who tell you with no humor, with no irony, they'll tell you, in Buddhism there is no legend of the creation of the universe, of how the world was created. Yes, there is. Yes, there is, and most of them have read it. They've actually read the text. They're lying to you because they're uncomfortable dealing with that text and its implications to their religion. Many of them will just lie to you straight to your face. They will say, oh no, there is no doctrine of hell. There's no concept of hell in the ancient scriptures and the Pali Canon. Woo! Does anyone want to estimate how many pages describe hell, or what percentage of all the pages in the ancient canon are devoted to the description of hell? It's a lot. Okay, there are very detailed descriptions of hell. And again, with those people, when someone like me talks to them, I can ask them, have you actually not read one page out of the Pali Canon, or are you intentionally lying about this? Are you aware that you're lying? So the simple facts of what the texts say about altered states of consciousness, nobody wants to deal with. And that's your first big red flag, that as soon as you start looking into this, you're going to find that it's bullshit. It's just bullshit. Now, in the same way, let's just say the self-help elements of the Church of Scientology are bullshit. However, there's then this next step of offering an analysis of why do people like it, why do people become enthusiastic, why do they become faithful towards it, so on and so forth, right? And there is something there to be analyzed. What Scientology, what the cult of Scientology offers people to hook them and draw them in, and what they find rewarding about it, that may be worth understanding. Although we can only take that second step if we've already established, look, the doctrine itself is bullshit. There's no way to proceed to step 2 without really in a sound and sincere way dealing with step 1. I would say that also, by the way, about the rise and fall of the cult of Rajneesh, also known as the cult of Osho. It is quite interesting to look at interviews with people who were members of that cult and try to figure out what was it they liked about it. Why did they make excuses for all the things that were wrong about it? Why did they become passionate devotees of this? Why did they, from my perspective, make themselves slaves of this ideology? And that's all the more tragic, right? I mean, but you could apply this even to political extremism in our own times, but you can't take that step without really first fully recognizing the doctrine itself is bunk and hokum. So in this way, I have to acknowledge the following. If you squeeze your arm muscle, not even lifting an object, if you just sit there right now and close your eyes and mentally clench the muscle in your arm as tightly as you can for as long as you can, and then you release it, you will feel a very peculiar kind of tingling in your arm. The mental exercises that induce these so-called altered states of consciousness are very much the mental equivalent of this, right? So it's kind of hilarious to me the extent to which people who are proponents of the jhanas tend to indict themselves through, in this way, revealing that it doesn't matter what object you meditate on, what it is you're meditating about, just as long as you're clenching your mind in this way, that you have this super concentrated use of your mind, you will get the same results. So this is one aspect of it. And this is why Buddhists, modern Buddhists today certainly, they are just as comfortable endorsing navel gazing. That's a form of meditation, if you didn't know. And it's not just a sarcastic term in English. Navel gazing, wall gazing, visualizing something like a white circle in your mind, a completely abstract, just imagine this white circle and then focus on it. They'll also just as easily endorse sitting and staring at a skull, like, where you place an object in front of you, like so, and meditating on the skull. The idea that just if you keep your mind in this super concentrated, super focused state of tension, that then you're going to experience an altered state of consciousness thereafter, right? So this is very much like using the muscle of your arm in a kind of strenuous and somewhat unnatural way, and then you have a completely meaningless feeling. It's a feeling. An altered state of mind is just a feeling. That's all there is to it. It has no narrative content. That's one element of what's going on here. Another is the very real element of hallucination and the real experience of making the transition from being awake to dreaming, sometimes very rapidly. Now, some of you in the audience won't have experienced these things. Some of you will have experienced them in numerous conditions. I have gone to respectable Chinese Mahayana temples where they were giving the meditators hallucinogenic tea. At one of the temples where they were doing that, I challenged one of the administrators about this. I said, look, this contains hallucinogens. And, I know I can read the label on the tea. Do you really think it's ethical or moral to be giving people a hallucinogenic drug? And even though it's very mild, it's not nearly as strong as LSD. And then you sit there and close your eyes and, what do you know? You kind of see things, Yeah. I have meditated with a Zen master who was giving me and the other meditators a really heavy dose of caffeine just through traditional, basically like a Japanese tea ceremony. It was actually Korean tradition, but style of serving tea in this case wasn't so different. So if you get really pumped up on green tea, so you get a lot of caffeine going, and then you sit there, in a meditative posture, holding your body completely still with your eyes closed, your mind is racing because you're high on this caffeine. This is another type of meditative experience. And as many of the meditative instructors and gurus will tell you, they'll say, oh, it doesn't matter what you think about. You can think about nothing at all. You can keep your mind in this blank state or focus on a white circle or in the Zen tradition, repeat the same phrase over and over again. The most meaningless thing imaginable can still get the same results. So this would be like my saying to you, my method of getting this tingling feeling in your arm. It doesn't matter if you squeeze one object or another in your hand while flexing the muscle in your arm, you'll still get the same miraculous results. But of course, ironically, tragically, there's nothing miraculous about the results. Okay? If you have experience with illness, you may have experience with the extent to which the human mind will lapse into hallucination just through exhaustion, illness. In the ancient world, people were sick all the time. Very unglamorous diseases like amoebic dysentery lead to hallucination. I have had from tropical fever. If you just get a fever, you can go straight from being awake into hallucinating, semi-dreamlike state and so on. And again, you may, even with jet lag or something, if you ever have the experience of you're riding a bus, you're looking around, you're awake, and then woo, you're asleep. You go straight from being awake to being asleep. And it has the same effect of hallucinating. I mean, dreams are much more intense in terms of narrative content than any drug-induced hallucination. So you can imagine with a lot of these ritual traditions where you have people who are sleep deprived, they're at least high on caffeine, if not other drugs. But if you get people who are in this upright posture, you can very easily go from being awake and in this strangely focused state to slipping into a dreamlike state. And what you see is neither more nor less meaningful than any dream. I can remember reading one book from one Buddhist monk that was honest about that. And I think I mentioned this in a YouTube video before, but he reflected that in his hallucinations or in his dreams, in his visions, if you like, he could recognize the elements of his own fantasy. He recognized that when he met the Buddha resembled a particular style of statue, of art, that was his preferred style of statue of depicting the Buddha, and he knew intellectually that's not what the Buddha actually looked like in India. That's a style of making statues that developed centuries later. Like he was capable of interrogating his own religious experience and discovering it to be nothing more than a dream or hallucination. So we have about three components to this in sum. There is the sad reality that the original texts, the original doctrine of the jhanas, it's just bullshit. And the second step is most of the modern interpreters, proponents of this doctrine, they're aware of the weakness of the text. So they direct your attention away from it. It's like, no, don't read what the text actually says. Look, they're not going to explain this to you in the same way a Christian would explain the Sermon on the Mount, by working from the text and explain to you step by step. No. They are much more likely to misdirect you, to talk to you about something like vipassana. Vipassana doesn't even exist in the ancient text. This is a completely modern movement. It's really anti-Buddhist or un-Buddhist, but it's been attached on the name of Buddhism. No. Don't pay attention to what the ancient texts say. So there's the weakness of the ancient text. One of the modern responses is to distract you away from that, direct you away from that, and then try to present you with some kind of newfangled doctrine of meditation. And then there's the sickening human psychology of how people get attached to this. Their egos latch onto it, and they make themselves slaves to this ideology. I was once in a discussion that included Bhikkhu Bodhi, famous Buddhist monk, several other people sitting in a circle, and for whatever reason, people were attacking the egotism of people like myself, people who really had a scholarly approach to actually studying the ancient text and knowing what the text meant. And it was sort of very self-serving, they were all patting themselves on the back, as if all the people in the room, except for me, they were all profound and wise enough to not spend their time studying what the ancient texts actually say. This would be like a bunch of Christians saying they're profound enough to just engage in prayer and not read what the Bible actually says. They don't worry themselves with that. Isn't it sad that studying the text leads to this terrible ego trip that, that people who study the history of the religion and the actual doctrine and Scripture, that they know what the religion's about and other people don't. That's really very sad, as opposed to people who just live in pious ignorance, right? And I countered this argument that, again, not just one person was presenting, but several people were all kind of agreeing with one another. And I said to them, look, I think studying the ancient texts, someone who actually does it, is humbling. Because no matter how much you know, you're aware, even just by looking at the books on the shelf you haven't read yet, you're aware of how much more there is to know. So you see your knowledge in that context. I said, I've got to tell you something. I meet people all the time who pay for a weekend course in meditation and who come back literally believing that they are a bodhisattva, that they are an incarnation of a deity or of the future Buddha or whatever it is. People can convince themselves that they're on almost any religious ego trip imaginable, because what meditation does is basically give them an opportunity to indulge in their own self-deceptive fantasies, to indulge in dreaming, both literally and not so literally. And whatever experience they have, whether it be a mild tingling of the mind, whether it be an altered state of consciousness, whether it be something like a hallucination, whatever they see, whatever they feel, they can cling on to that as a token and think that most dangerous thought of all. They can think, I'm special. Buddhism is, in this sense, much more dangerous than Christianity, because every day millions and millions of Christians pray, but incredibly few have the delusion that God spoke directly to them. Instead, what they live with is the existential terror of the silence of God, that here they are praying and nobody talks back, right? And when people do think that God is talking to them directly, they are regarded as insane. There are exceptions. There are Christian cult groups, and there are people who think that they're a prophet and so on. But for the most part, that is the state of Christianity in the 21st century. And Buddhism is at the opposite extreme, where if somebody sits down, again, quite possibly after drinking a hallucinogenic tea or in whatever conditions, if someone just sits down and when they're meditating, they happen to see some colors and shapes, just the mildest level of, altered state of consciousness or hallucination, they visualize something, anything, they can stand up off of that prayer mat saying that they're on a mission, that they're special, that they now have a sense of purpose that's been revealed to them, that they know something nobody else knows, that they've had revealed to them, some kind of divine and transcendental wisdom. And this motivates people to suicidal acts of devotion. It is not merely, we may say, that this way madness lies, but in this way we reveal the madness that is at the core of Buddhism, both ancient and modern.